Yeah, how about that? My name is Doreen Mike Dyer, and I'm the Education Director out here at the Historical Museum. So glad to see so many of you come out tonight for History from the Ashes, Stories of a Big Burn, written and performed by Ben Kemper. Ben Kemper is a 20-year-old storyteller who has been telling stories locally, nationally, and internationally since he was 9 years old. His mother said since he was this big. In 2007, he represented Idaho at the National Youth Storytelling Showcase, winning the Grand Torchbearer Award for his original story, stage presence, and storytelling ambassadorship. Graduating from Boise High School in 2010, Ben has taken a gap year before going off to Northwestern University. To research, write, and perform today's story, History from the Ashes, Stories of the Big Burn, he will play 14 different characters in the telling of this momentous event in our local history. Major funding for History from the Ashes is provided by the Idaho Humanities Council, Idaho Firewise, and the American Society of Foresters Snake River chapters. Please turn off your cell phones, and if you have not filled out the performance evaluation, his parents are here, and we'll make sure you do. And enjoy the performance. Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Kemper.
Good evening, and thank you for coming out on this wonderful summer evening to venture into the past. Behold the fire. So small, isn't it? Little bigger than your fingertip. Heat, light, and energy. Everything we need to survive. But let it burn too long, and it can become something else entirely. So what should we do with fire? Should we let it burn, or should we put it out? Now, as a retired forest ranger, I would caution you all against playing with fire. It has a way of getting out of your hands. Well, there are stories round this state of a fire so big that it consumed 3 million acres, 6 towns, and 87 lives, all in a space of less than 48 hours. Those stories are true. I should know. I was there. I saw it happen. Well, in 1908, when I was just 19 years old, I strode into the offices of the United States Forest Service in Wallace, Idaho. I had never been west of the Mississippi River before, and the dew of the Yale School of Forestry hung fresh on me. I strode in, burning up with the fire of youth, ready to take on the world. But instead of a bustling government agency, I was met by 4 blank stares from 4 men clustered around a small, dusty table in a small, dusty room. Little did I know that these 4 men would be amongst the most important that I would ever meet. They didn't look like much at first. To tell the truth, they looked just like that new Coolidge painting, Dogs Playing Poker. All that was missing was the chips and cards. The district supervisor, the head honcho, William Greeley, with his lanky build and big round spectacles, looked to me no more than a spaniel in a suit. Standing next to him was Ehlers Koch, a Montana-born ranger, very officious, very no-nonsense. He reminded me of a Jack Russell Terrier, short, stocky, with a clipboard clamped between his jaws. Standing next to him was Bill Weagle, a big guy with copper red hair who would crack a joke every 5 minutes on the dot. He was, of course, an Irish setter. And leaning next to him, a wolfhound, a man with grim eyes and a grim smile, Big Ed Pulaski. Now, these 4 men were the elite of those who wore the pine tree shield badge. 3 of them had been hand-picked for their positions by none other than Gifford Pinchot, the chief forester himself. Though truth be told, our real orders came from President Theodore Roosevelt. I had gone through Yale listening to stories of how Roosevelt fought like Hercules to protect the forest rangers, his own pet project. In 1907, Congress itself, tired of the president dictating environmental policy to them, had developed a spending bill which, among other things, curtailed the power of the president to create national forest reserves without the express approval of the legislature. Now, if Roosevelt signed this bill, he would effectively cripple the Forest Service as an agency. But if he didn't sign, then the entire congressional budget would be unmet for that year, and the whole government would grind to a halt. Now, those were wild days of politics, and I am certain that nothing like that could ever happen again. Still, it didn't faze Roosevelt one bit. He was unstoppable. The week before he had to sign that bill, he spent every night, sundown to sunup, cooped in the Oval Office, Gifford Pinchot at his side, poring over hundreds of maps and reports and shouting, "Ah, this is funny! All right, GP, take a look over here. I saw the biggest herd of white-tailed deer just about here. By Godfrey, it was electrifying. All right, so what do you say? Is North Idaho good stomping grounds for your boys?" "Well, Mr. President, it's hardly what I'd call a friendly territory, but then again, why not?" "That's the spirit, man!" "All right. I, Theodore Roosevelt, President of these here United States, hereby create the Coeur d'Alene National Forest Reserve. Charge!" That was Roosevelt. Unstoppable. I wanted to be just like him. When I got into the Forest Service, I was ready to implement his big stick policies. But it turned out that when dealing with Westerners, what was required was tact and respect and understanding. And these were qualities that Yale had ill prepared me for. My new instructor was Ed Pulaski, the wolfhound. He was a real Westerner. Before becoming a forest ranger, he had been a miner, a ranch hand, and a railroad worker. I remember many dinners with Ed and his wife Emma and daughter Elsie, cooped up in their snug little cabin on the edge of Wallace. Ranger Pulaski would sit me down and say, "You're not going to make many friends out here, kid. Want to know why? People think you're a patent leather man. That means you don't know the first thing about timber, the West, or living life. Now, it's your job to prove them wrong. I want you to find the most difficult personality on your route, and I want you to earn their respect. Only then will I consider you a real forest ranger." It was a long time before I was considered a real forest ranger in the eyes of Mr. Pulaski. See, the toughest personality I had to deal with was a woman, not more than 25 years old, by the name of Ione Adair. Now, Miss Adair was the eldest daughter of a wealthy Moscow doctor. And by rights, she should have been a socialite, going to garden parties and eating cucumber sandwiches. But did she like to do that? Not a bit. Her idea of a good time was spending half the year in a little cabin right smack dab in the center of the St. Joe National Forest. Everybody called her Pinky Adair because of her red hair and freckles, and I don't mean to stereotype, but she had a temper to boot. I don't give a bent pin for any of your rules or regulations. And if any one of your boss men has a problem with that, he better come and talk to me. Miss Adair tolerated my occasional visits to her homestead, but there was another ranger, Ashley Roach, who really got under her collar. It was Mr. Roach's thankless job to go from homestead to homestead to homestead and find out the squatters on government land. And when he took a look around Pinky Adair's property, he decided that her claim must obviously be fraudulent and suggested her immediate removal. Nobody took this up with Miss Adair. Not only did she have a legitimate claim, but she also carried a .38 revolver wherever she went. And looking at it was the only warning you got. This is not to say that all the folks I had to deal with were like Miss Adair. I liked visiting the Petersons up in Eagle Creek, only the promise of a town. Paul Peterson, formerly of Norway, had come to America hoping to strike it rich with a big lumber mill, which was exactly what he had done. His wife, Ivy Peterson, now there was a born gentlewoman. I do not once remember seeing Mrs. Peterson go out of the house without a hat and white gloves, not even to chop wood or carry water. Her sister Norma was another character entirely. Whereas Ivy was the white gloves, Norma was the dirty palms. Norma worked for a lumber company near Avery, Idaho, and she used to say to me, "There are 3 things I like in this life more than all else: straight whiskey, a good cigar, and a strapping lumberman." I liked talking with Norma. And Paul and Ivy too, of course. They made a welcome break from having to deal with avalanches, floods, and, most terrible of all, fires. Now, for those of you who know a bit about the Forest Service, you know that for the likes of us, there are only 2 times of year. There is fire season, and then there is the time spent preparing for fire season. Back in the aught years, we had something to prove, that the Forest Service could help save civilians and valuable property from the chaos and destruction of wildfire. And that meant in layman's terms that not only did we have to put out every blaze that was reported, we had to look good doing it. And for 5 years, we did exactly that. But no one could have guessed at the horrors we would face in 1910. It started off as a dry year. And by mid-April, we realized we were in for a record drought. Record droughts mean record fire seasons. The hands and the fates of the Northwest forests lay before the feet of 3 men: Bill Weagle, Ehlers Koch, and William Greeley. That is to say, a joking Irish setter, an officious Jack Russell Terrier, and a spaniel in a suit. I can still imagine them standing up over Wallace on the ridge in June, Ranger Pulaski at their side, looking out over the valley, watching the first dry lightning crackle in the distance. Mr. Greeley was so pious that he would puncture his orders with religious quotation. Even now I can hear him saying, "There, another! Do you mark it, Mr. Koch?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Greeley." Let's see, that is the 6th lightning strike to the southwest. Should I send a smoke chaser up here to keep an eye on it? Please do. I think Ranger Roche would be admirable for this job. Oh, Father, how have we offended thee? How have we called this cruel and desolate hour down upon ourselves? Excuse me, Mr. Greeley. I don't mean to interrupt a private conversation, but it seems to me that no good deed should go unpunished. And so we ought to thank the Almighty for sending us a plague of fires to test our resolve, right? Am I right? Oh, you hush yourself, Bill Weagle. This is no laughing matter. The forest out there is as dry as kindling and thick with fuel. I don't want to think about what will happen when the wind picks up. Ranger Pulaski, you're our man on the ground. What do you have to say? Do we have the resources to handle this? With respect, Mr. Koch, we don't have a stumble's chance in hell. I reckon that by midsummer, there'll be more than 100 fires burning through this part of the Rockies alone. We don't have the money, and we certainly don't have the men. We'll be absolutely swamped. Mr. Pulaski is correct. This summer shall be our trial. All of us must either emerge triumphant from the lion's den or perish in the flames. And on that optimistic note, we set to work. Every day, our rough and tumble fire crews would wake and head out into the woods trying to stop fires. Not a day passed, but we saw a new column of smoke rising over the peaks. The fires were buried deep in the back country, like ticks in dog's fur, growing bigger by the hour. When we found a blaze, our first order of business was to draw a fire line around it, stripping the forest down to the bare soil, making a path twice as wide as the flames were high. After that, we would begin to pour buckets of water and shovel earth onto the flames, driving it back, stamping it out. In the towns, people were beginning to feel the effects of the drought. No one went outside without a wet kerchief pressed over their noses and mouths. At night, they would guzzle water by the quart and lie on the floor so as to breathe easier. It grew so dark some days that chickens would come home to roost at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And every day, we foresters, Weagle and Koch especially, began to look more and more like exhausted dogs. We were fighting fires daily, and when we weren't fighting, we were recruiting. We grabbed bums off the street, convicts from the prison, every sort of immigrant, Indians off the reservation. We took everybody. Mr. Greeley decided that his spaniel qualities were best put to use in Missoula, at the District 1 offices, where he would endeavor to beat back our other eternal foes, politicians and the press. Without further funds from Washington, we will have no men and no resources to combat future fires. Towns will be put to torch. Priceless timber will be consumed in flame. And yet, if the good Lord sees fit to smile on us, I am certain that the Forest Service and her firefighting crews will yet carry the day. It was looking less and less likely that the good Lord was smiling on us. By August, the army had been called in to give us a hand. We were mighty grateful for the help, but for the people of Wallace in particular, this caused something of a stir, for these were not the kind of armed forces that they had been expecting. They were buffalo soldiers, black men in the service of the U.S. of A. One of them was Private Franklin T. Willis of the 25th Infantry. I still remember when we detrained in Wallace. Last time we'd been in that city was during the mining wars of '99. We'd been called in to enforce martial law, and now, seeing us with our Springfields and blue uniforms marching down Main Street, a whole regiment of colored men, well, I guess that brought back a lot of bad memories to a lot of folks. I don't know my letters, but I can read faces pretty well, and none of us were welcome there. For ordinary citizens, life was becoming increasingly difficult. The prickly Pinky Adair in her isolated cabin was getting more company than she had ever bargained for. Every day, dusty firefighters would stumble up the trail to her door, asking for food, for news, for a place to lick her scrapes and burns. She took them all in until one day, Ranger Roche, the same man who had tried to turn her off of her land, came stumbling up the trail and asked her to come to his camp and cook. I have a crew of 14 men, and we haven't eaten in 3 days. If I don't get victuals into them, they're gonna walk off and leave this part of the forest undefended. Will you come, Miss Adair? Now why should I help you, Ranger Roche? You were the one tried to turn me off my land. I apologize for any assumptions I made about you in my report, but to speak frankly, if the fire comes through and my men have walked off, it won't matter who owns this property. I can pay you for your time. How much? $1 a day. For how long? Couple months, couple weeks, a few days. I don't know, Miss Adair. Fine. I'll go along and cook for you, Mr. Roach. Just let me throw a few things in the sack and, Mr. Roach, no funny business. Well, a good cook makes the difference between a firefighting crew and a mutiny in the mountains. Pinky did her level best with potatoes, onions, bread made in a rough stone oven. She was a little surprised and displeased when Ranger Roche decided a few weeks in that he was best to move his crew to join a couple of others scattered out through the St. Joe, and Pinky found herself with 74 and not 14 men to provide for. She was even more surprised and displeased to discover that in requests for the Forest Service's pleas for labor, convicts had been turned out of the local jails and set amongst the crew. Pinky put the threat of her pistol to good use. Now, if any one of you lout so much as looks at me the wrong way, I will not hesitate to blow your ears right off, along with other things. Only the placations of Roach and the promise of a payday kept Pinky in line. And so it was she came to be out in the middle of nowhere when the big burn fell like a hammer stroke. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of a palooser. A palooser is a strong wind blowing through the mountain canyons. Usually it's little more than a tomcat breeze thrown its weight around. But sometimes that tomcat can become a tiger of a gale. And on the afternoon of August 20th, 1910, a palooser arrived in the North Rockies strong as a hurricane. It came pouring down out of a ghastly yellow sky, blasting through the mountain peaks with battering ram force. I heard tell of that wind blowing men straight out of their saddles and ripping up trees by the roots. And wherever that wind hit, the once defeated fires rekindled. Flames, little more than a foot high, began to race up the sides of the trees, get into the canopy and start to crown, leaping outwards from tree to tree, spreading like the ripples in a pond, faster than a man could run. That wind whipped up a fire 6 miles long in some places, 30 stories high, and advancing at more than 80 miles per hour. Birds were incinerated in mid-flight. Thousands of animals were charbroiled by the heat. Cinders fell as far away as Chicago. And some scientists said that the energy produced by those flames was equal to that of a 15-ton load of TNT going off every 2 minutes. Now you have to remember, there were more than 1,000 firefighters sprinkled throughout the North Rockies, along with who knows how many homesteaders who hadn't fled to the towns. These were trapped almost immediately. In Ranger Roche's crew, the 74 men and 1 woman stopped what they were doing as a sound unlike anything they had yet heard arose above the roar of the wind. It sounded like a locomotive headed their way. Down the river valley, a wave of smoke came into sight, backlit by a red glow, and in its depths they could see the trees going over each other like 9 pins. Ranger Roche was the first one to recover his senses. He yelled, "Fire, everyone! Fire! Get in the creek! Get in the creek! He'll jump over us! Now!" After the last man and woman had submerged themselves beneath the surface, the fire rolled through, obliterating the camp within a minute. It leaped over the creek in a great blaze of red, gold, and deep purple. Lying where she was, her head covered by a wet blanket, Pinky could feel the blisters begin to rise on her arms. She tried to push herself deeper under the shallow water of the creek and listened until the roar of the freight train passed and the heat began to diminish. Rising up, she looked around at the burning forest. Wrapping her coat and her sodden blanket about her shoulders, she started off towards the bank. Behind her, Ranger Roche popped his head out of the creek and hissed, "Miss Adair! Miss Adair, where do you think you're going? I order you to stay where you are." "I'm not staying here, Mr. Roach. I'm not dying in this creek." And she was out of his sight, stumbling away towards Avery, Idaho, 30 miles distant. In the Pulaski cabin, Emma and Elsie had just finished washing up from dinner when the wind rattled the window panes and brought the scratch of smoke to their nostrils. Stepping outside, Ed Pulaski, who had come back for a day to collect supply horses and to see his family, saw great clouds of smoke rising over the peaks and saw the first orange embers start to tumble down like snow. Those boys are going to go all to pieces if someone isn't out there to help them. Elsie, get my horse saddled up. There's not a moment to lose. Emma, now listen to me and listen good. Wallace is going to burn, so save yourselves. When the time comes, do not get on the train. You'll be headed into a firestorm. Instead, take Elsie and an armload of blankets and go down to the river. Stay in the shallows, keep away from trees, and do not come out until the fire is well past. Now, if anything happens to me, well, I guess I'll know you'll be safe. Leaping up upon his horse, Pulaski looked down at his wife and child. I may never see you again. Goodbye. And pistol on hip, he rode off to meet his fate. He did not once look back. In Wallace proper, Bill Weagle found himself swarmed on every side. The mayor, city council, and every prominent citizen wanted to know what they should do. Should they order the escape trains and try to head to Spokane or Missoula, or should they stay in their homes and see if the fire would swing round past them? Weagle tried to deal with them as best he could. Now listen up, folks. There is no need to panic. Tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to ride to the top of the ridge over yonder, and I will take a look out over the country. If I think that Wallace is in any particular danger, I will come straight down, and together we can conduct a nice, orderly evacuation. There is, I repeat, no need to panic. Still, if you see me coming down that slope with my pants on fire, I guess you can call me a liar, huh? It was a tough crowd. Meanwhile, Ed Pulaski had rounded up nearly 50 men in the slopes above Wallace, together with 3 supply horses laden with blankets and tins of water. He gathered them together and discussed their options for escape. Wallace was too far and the flames too fast. There was Elsie Lake nearby, but the slopes to it were too steep and the water too deep, and they would escape burning only to be drowned. Eventually, the ideas stopped coming as each man's thought turned toward the home he would never see, the family he would never hear from, the flames licking at his feet and hands and face. Staring into the darkness, listening to the oncoming locomotive of fire, Ranger Pulaski made one last decision and ordered the men to grab the horses and follow him. Above them, Bill Weagle was taking the last of the incline on foot. He had just crested the hill when his usual Irish setter humor evaporated, and he stared out between the trees. Oh my Lord! Oh my Lord! Before him, a dozen fire whirls, self-made tornadoes of flames, smoke, and burning debris, gyrated over a sea of red. They looked like great black columns supporting the great hall of hell itself. This was a true firestorm, an inferno moving towards Wallace at a rate of nearly 2 miles a minute. Weigel turned and threw himself down the slope. He had to order those escape trains as soon as possible. But the fire was already well ahead of him. 10 miles distant, a branch was ripped from a flaming tree and sent spinning across the valley. It flew over the top of the hill and past Bill Weigel, whizzing like a mortar shell. It hit the long line of dry trees before him, and the whole burst into a wall of red. Bill Weigel was trapped on a flaming mountainside. Below, the people of Wallace had made their own decisions. Mayor Hansen had called for the escape trains, and the people were beginning to bury their treasures underneath floorboards and in their backyards. But already the fire had vaulted the ridge and was bearing down on them. A great rush commenced for the train station right in front of the eyes of Private Willis of the 25th Infantry. It was awful. Now, I've been to the front lines, and I've seen men turn to savages more than once. But that rush? It had been decided beforehand that women and children were to have first seats on the trains, and all able-bodied men were to stay behind and defend Wallace. Everyone had agreed to that beforehand, but now I saw big men, important men who had sworn on their souls to stay and defend the city, grabbing women by the hair and throwing them down to the platform. I did what I could to stop them, but Mayor Hansen said, "Leave them. They're all just going to roast to death on the way out of town anyway." It was true. Fleeing by rail might just mean immolation further down the line. The tracks were lined with slash and other combustibles, and there were falling trees, collapsing tunnels, burning trestles. But it was the only option many people would take. Up in Eagle Creek, another desperate train ride was already underway. Paul Peterson and his men were lighting backfires to stop the spread of the inferno. And while they did this, Ivy Peterson, the white gloves gentlewoman, rounded up every woman in town, from the preacher's wife to the ladies of negotiable affection in the saloon. Together, they stripped blankets from beds, dunked them in the river, and with their children and prized possessions, clambered up on the flatbeds of a lumber train, much like what you can see behind you now. And with no other protection than an inch of sodden wool, they waved the engineer to pull out into the big burn and try to make it to safety. For Ivy Peterson, it was worse than a nightmare. I don't know how many times we had to stop the train. Within 5 minutes, the blankets in our hands grew warm and dry and started to steam. I would wave to the engineer and he would stop the train. Thanks be to the heavens that the tracks continued along the river. We would run down and dip our blankets in the water and scramble back again. I don't know how many times we had to do this. My gloves were absolutely soiled on the third run. But it did my heart good to see each of those women working hard to make sure that no one was unprotected. Ranger Pulaski also had his work cut out for him, making sure no man was left behind. He was leading his followers through the ashy waters of Placer Creek, his ankles bobbing against the bellies of asphyxiated fish. He was trying to lead them to the Nicholson Shaft, a mine he himself had helped dig out before he joined the service. At 200 feet, the Nicholson Shaft was long enough and deep enough that Pulaski figured that if he could stop the fresh air being displaced by smoke, and if he could stop the wooden supports from burning away in the heat, they might all just make it through the night. Behind him, there was a crash and a shriek. A blazing tree had fallen and pinned Richard Wood, the last man in line, to the ground. Turning, Pulaski could see the fires race and catch the unfortunate man and burn until the screams died away. Pulaski shook his head. There was nothing to be done, but he saw the mine ahead. "Come on, everybody! Get in the mine! In! Horses too! Right! You all hear me? Good. This is what we're going to do. I'm going to stand here with this blanket and make sure these supports don't burn away. The rest of you stay down. Keep as low to the ground as you possibly can. Those near the horses, keep their heads lower than their knees. If we do this, we might all just make it through the night and see the morning. You understand me?" A figure rose in the blackness of the tunnel and yelled, "I'm not staying here. I'm not dying in this death trap. I'm going to take my chances in the creek." And reaching for his pistol, Pulaski snarled, "The first man who tries to get by me gets a bullet in the head. Sit down!" Elsewhere, Pinky Adair had just finished the most harrowing journey of her life. She had scrambled 30 miles through burning forest, dodging falling trees, scrambling up great piles of downed timber, nearly deep frying her leg in a pool of molten ash. She was covered head to toe in gray soot. The soles of her boots smoked, but she was alive and in Avery and just in time to see the last escape train pull away from the station. Hot-footing her way down the station platform, Pinky pounded on the scorching metal sides. "Please, let me on! I'll shovel coal for you! I'll ride on the roof!" A conductor swung out of his station and grabbed her by the arm. "Come aboard, miss! Don't worry, no one's gonna leave you behind." And from the window, Pinky Adair watched the path back to her own little homestead disappear in a sea of smoke. At the opposite end of the tracks, Ehlers Koch was just putting the final touches on the Forest Service's emergency budget for the 1910 fire season. He had spent the entire week in Missoula giving Mr. Greeley a hand. But when news of the big blow-up reached his ears, he threw down his clipboard, grabbed his jacket, and started for the door. "Mr. Koch, where do you think you're going?" "Begging your pardon, Mr. Greeley, but I just spent my life savings making sure those men were well supplied and safe. And you'll pardon my language, but I'll be damned before I see any of them come to harm." And out he went. Koch was a recently married man with a little one on the way, but he wasted not a second as he jumped aboard a relief train headed towards Wallace. Past St. Regis, Superior, and Henderson, the train thundered until it arrived at DeBorgia, Montana, and there it could go no further. The fire was coming up the valley in force, and the train and station were packed with refugees of every description. Koch helped those who needed help get on the train, and looking out the window, he saw the fire swing round to cut them off on the south side of the track. As the train reversed, he saw a great blazing pine tip and fall across the rails, blocking their escape. Without wasting a moment, Koch grabbed an armload of blankets and shouted down the crowded Pullman car, "I need every able-bodied man out here to help me now!" And then, leaping into the falling embers, Koch and 16 other brave souls wrapped their hands in blankets and charged the flaming tree. They set themselves up against it and pushed and heaved until finally they rolled it off the rails, leaping back aboard the train as it thundered on ahead of the fire. It was a heroic escape, but other trains were not so lucky. Norma, Ivy Peterson's Dirty Palm sister, was on one of the last escape trains headed towards Missoula. Despite her usual bravado, she was not looking forward to a ride over the gorges. "Dear God, please get me through this alive, and I swear to you I will never touch whiskey or a cigar again. Maybe just sherry and cheroots on special occasions." Everything went fine until the train emerged from one of the tunnels on the Idaho-Montana border, and there it squealed to a halt right in front of a flaming trestle spanning a burning gorge. Looking out from the engine car, the engineer and the fireman could see the wood begin to blacken and the metal began to twist. Would it hold the weight of the train? A decision was made to back up inside the tunnel and wait for the worst of the fire to pass through. Deep in the darkness of the mountain, listening to the fire and the wind rage above, Norma took a look down the car. She could barely see the outlines of her fellow passengers, but she could hear them praying and sobbing and gasping. The tunnel was a tomb, and the engine was still pumping out carbon monoxide, that deadly, suffocating gas down every nose and throat. Within a half hour, that train would be filled with untouched, tightly packed corpses. Fortunately, the engine driver cottoned on just in time and threw the train forward. Out over the burning trestle it surged, fighting the hunger of fire and the pull of gravity. Pressed up against the window, Norma remembered the scene to her dying instant. It looked like we were riding straight into the jaws of hell, and I went and wet my pants. But the train made it and was safe and speeding across the other side as the trestle collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks. Arriving at the Missoula station, Norma disembarked, looking down the line of cars in fascinated horror. Those compartments which had kept her and her fellow passengers from being roasted alive were twisted by the heat, and wood varnish ran down the sides to hiss on the rails. Smoke hung thick as fog. A red line devoured the western horizon, but she was safe. For the moment. Some were not safe at all. Bill Weagle, the Irish setter, was even now pressing back into a cave in the flaming mountainside. He had only survived this long because of a pool of water at his feet. But he knew that unless he got out of there soon, the smoke would push the air out of his lungs and he would suffocate. Dipping his hat in the pool of water and tossing it over his head, the Irish setter ran out into the flaming world and immediately backtracked up the mountainside, trying to make it to a burned-over area. The hairs on the backs of his hands caught fire and held it to his skin like candle wicks. His hair began to smolder and curl, and with a cry of agony, Weagle threw himself through the last wall of flame and fell to the ash-covered dirt, scrabbling at it, trying to snuff up the last breath of air. Eventually, the world stopped cackling at him, and the heat receded, and Weagle turned nearly fire-blinded eyes out to an alien world of black, gray, and white stumps. Rising to his shaking legs, he turned and headed downhill towards what had once been the greatest city in North Idaho. Deep in the Nicholson mine, Pulaski was fighting a losing battle. While he had stopped the supports from burning away, his hands had been terribly scorched in the attempt. His eyes could barely differentiate between light and dark. And at last, the last of the air in his lungs was pushed away by the gas and smoke, and he pitched forward, lost to all the world. All night, the firefighters lay unconscious in the dark of the mine, but in the morning, the strongest raised their heads and heard neither devilish laughter nor heavenly harps. Crawling on their hands and feet, they made their way towards the light at the end of the tunnel, and there they surveyed the ashy water, the charred slope, and the limp body of the man that had saved their lives. Pulaski lay face down, cooling meat in the cooling ashes. The once proud wolfhound lay prone. One firefighter shook his head and wheezed, "You can come out now, boys. The boss is dead." "Like hell he is." Against all odds, Ranger Pulaski was alive. He was badly scorched, his clothing smoked, but he was alive, and nobody could say otherwise. The firefighters dragged themselves into the warm water of the creek and took account. 5 men, along with all 3 horses, had perished from suffocation in the depths of the mine. Rising to their legs, the firefighters started once again down the creek, past flaming logs and burning debris, slowly but surely heading homewards. Eventually, the wind stopped, and the rains came, and the fire halted its terrible Sherman's march. Folks began to return to the forest almost immediately to see what was left. I accompanied one poor fellow searching for his homestead and found only a pile of charred timbers, the well cover, and his wife's sewing machine, warped by the heat. Picking it up, the poor man said, "Well, old Stitcher, looks like you're the only thing left." And a voice from beneath our feet cried out, "And me!" The well cover was pushed aside, and Roach Fitzpatrick, a boy of little more than 16, clambered out into the daylight. He had had the presence of mind while fleeing from the flames to dive down the well and pull the cover after him. He had spent nearly 24 hours dog paddling in the dark while the fire burned above him. It took a long time for those flames to die out. I found trunks, stumps, still warm and smoking, buried in 5 feet of snow as late as the following February. And the people, they were the worst hit. To this day, there is not one blade of grass to be found in some of the patches that were burned in Idaho and Montana. And the people, for generations down, still carry the scars of those 2 days. Bill Weigel, one of the last things he said to me was, "You know, fire always changes people. Usually it changes them into cinders, but it always changes them." And he was right. Not one person who lived through the fires of 1910 went away unchanged, and not always for the bad. Pinky Adair gave up her life as a rough-and-tumble frontierswoman. She moved back to Moscow to spend time with her family and pursue a career as an elementary school teacher, where I'm sure her temper and her pistol came into good use. Norma Peterson, Ivy's sister, also turned over a new leaf. She became the very picture of respectability, the wife of a Princeton economics professor, though I am willing to bet that he smokes cigars and drinks whiskey. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Bill Weigel was one of the worst affected psychologically. Though he escaped with relatively minor injuries, he wanted nothing more to do with the forests that had nearly claimed his life. After handing in his report on the big blow-up of 1910, Weigel requested a transfer to the wettest place he knew of, Tongass National Forest in Alaska Territory, where he spent the rest of his life on a houseboat. Never wanted to do anything by halves, the Irish setter got out of fire in a big way. Though he wasn't on the front lines, Mr. Greeley, the spaniel in a suit, took the lessons of the Big Burn deep to heart. And when he became Chief Forester for the United States in 1920, he created one cardinal rule, one holy commandment, the 10 o'clock rule. Every fire reported to the Forest Service must be put out by 10 a.m. the following day. No exceptions. Oddly enough, it was Ehlers Koch who wrote the most and spoke the most and thought the most about the fires. He spent more than 40 years in the Forest Service, and toward the end of his career, he began to question Weigel's and Greeley's search and destroy methods. He reasoned that while you can fight fire, you can't hope to stamp it out entirely, and suggested that maybe using smaller, uncontrolled burns would decrease the risk of large, uncontrolled burns. The debate about who's right, Greeley with his 10 o'clock rule, or Koch with his light burning program, still rages to this day. And as for Pulaski, he never got over 1910. Though he recovered the use of his eyes and lungs, he was scarred for life. and forever a bitter man. He was particularly incensed that many of those firefighters injured by the burn were not given proper medical compensation. Young men would be carried into hospital having lost their means to make a living and leave in more debt than they could ever hope to repay. Pulaski did his best to provide for these and for those who had perished in the fire. But his chief legacy to them, the Forest Service, and firefighters the world over was a tool, one of his own devising, and an unusual one to boot. A strong, straight shaft, an axe for chopping wood, and a mattock for clearing away brush and rock and debris. The perfect thing for a firefighter drawing a fire line. Now, fire seasons have come and gone since 1910, some more impressive than others, but there is always the fear that no matter what policy we pursue, let it burn or put it out, that something like the big burn will blow out of the Rockies again. And if and when that does happen, courage and humanity and true grit will get us through, just like it did back then. And I think that when the smoke pours over the horizon, you'll need something you can rely upon, something that will draw a line between you and the unstoppable, something or someone. In a word, you'll need a Pulaski. Thank you. Thank you oh, shucks. Thank you very much. You're most kind. Thank you. Now, for those of you who want to see the museum before it closes or have private business to attend to, feel free to head on out to your cars or to the building. But for those of you who have a few questions about the story, please stick around and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. And please don't forget to fill out your evaluations. I would deeply appreciate it. And deposit them with the pen distributors and parental units over yonder. Yes?
You said that Pulaski's wife and child, he told them to stay behind. Did they do as he ordered, and did they survive?
They did indeed survive. They remained outside of Wallace near the river and were unharmed by the burn. So, I'd put that in, but the story's an hour as it is, and
It's okay, it gives people something to ask.
okay. Are there any questions? Yes.
How deeply did you have to research to get? Was there a lot of information? Were there diaries that
How deeply did I have to research to get all of this? Well, not that deeply, because the Forest Service does an excellent job of preserving the records of the fire season. There are also wonderful books by Stephen Pine and Tim Egan that are a blessing to read, and those were the two cornerstones on which we built the story. Also, the museums, such as the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, have excellent programs and information available, and so after a research trip through March through the sites that experienced the burn, I was able to string it all together.
There were newspapers too.
Sorry, what was that?
Of the character you played.
Oh, what becomes of the character I play? Oh, he disappears into, like the figment of imagination he is. James O'Neill, which is the pseudonym I created, is really a combination of Will Morris and Joe Halm, who were both young firefighters who had gone to Yale and come out west in the District 1 area during just before the time of 1910. And they had some horrifying adventures of their own, but I thought it best just to have an independent narrator to give a broad scope of the whole thing. Yes, sir.
Where did the black troops come from, Fort George White or Fort Missoula?
Did the black troops come from...
Fort George White, out of Spokane, or did they come from Missoula?
I believe they came from Spokane and not Missoula. I'm not entirely certain. I was unable to get the exact records of the movements of the 25th Infantry, so... But yes, I believe it is they came from Spokane. Yes, sir.
The 25th had been gone in 1898, so they came from Spokane.
Mm-hmm. All right. Any other questions, comments, criticisms, or concerns?
You might look into the Man Gulch fire and create a one-act play concerning that one.
No. Unfortunately, Norman McLean has beaten me to it. But,
He wrote a book.
well, he... certainly, but it's in the offing.
There's one survivor, though. You can impersonate him. He's about 70 now.
Really? Well, I'll have to look that up. Thank you.
How many died? About 20 or so?
All but 2.
Any other questions, or shall we call it a night?
One more quick one on the towns that were burned. Wallace was almost 100%, right? Or close.
No, surprisingly. Wallace was spared because 10 years earlier there had been a domestic fire that came through and leveled the whole town. So when they rebuilt, they used brick and stone and not primarily wood. So only about a third of the city was destroyed, and the rest was just heavily smoked, as it were.
You mentioned in your presentation about how many towns burned. How many were there?
6. And all right, thank you all very much for coming. Drive safely, enjoy the summer, and keep safe from fire.
Nice job.